Nate Porter had been working the night shift at the same gas station for 14 years. His shift always started at 10 in the evening and ended at 6 in the morning. He knew every crack on the concrete pavement, every flicker of the fluorescent light above pump number 3, and every regular who drove in after midnight. Nate was a quiet man, not because he was shy, but because he had learned that silence kept him safe. The gas station stood at the edge of a small town surrounded by empty fields and a two-lane road that disappeared into darkness in both directions. No cameras, no security guards, and no witnesses after 1 in the morning. That was why Nate had created his only rule, the one he never broke: never look at the passenger seat of any car that stopped for fuel after midnight. He did not know why the rule worked, but he knew that every person who had ignored it before him had quit the job within a week or had simply stopped showing up without a word. Nate valued his routine, his isolation, and his ability to go home unscathed as the sun rose over the highway. His boss was a man named Mr. Cade, a name printed on old contracts but attached to no face that anyone could remember. Nate had signed his papers 14 years ago in a small office with the blinds drawn, and he had never seen Mr. Cade again. The checks arrived by mail, and the instructions came through notes left in the lockbox behind the counter. One of those notes, yellowed and pinned to the wall, said simply, "Respect the night, and the night will respect you." Nate had followed that advice without question until a cold Tuesday night in November when a black sedan pulled up to pump 4 at exactly 11:45. The driver stepped out slowly, leaving the engine running, and Nate noticed two things immediately. First, the man was tall, dressed in a dark coat that seemed too heavy for the season, and he moved as if every step had been rehearsed. Second, the man kept his eyes on Nate the entire time, even as he reached for the fuel nozzle, even as he swiped a card at the pump, even as the numbers climbed on the display. Nate stood behind the counter pretending to read an old magazine, but his peripheral vision tracked every movement. The man finished fueling, walked toward the glass door of the small convenience store, and entered without a bell. The silence was complete, broken only by the hum of the refrigerators and the distant sound of wind across the fields. The man picked up a bottle of water, a pack of gum, and a small notebook from the shelf near the register. He placed everything on the counter, and Nate forced himself to look only at the items, never at the man's face, never at the car outside, and especially never at the passenger seat. The man paid in cash with exact change, and as he gathered his things, he left a black cell phone on the counter. Nate saw it but said nothing. He waited for the man to notice and return. Instead, the man walked out, started the sedan, and drove away, the red taillights shrinking into the darkness. Nate picked up the phone and felt its weight, a cheap model with a cracked screen, and he hesitated for a long moment. The rule was clear: do not engage, do not investigate, do not remember. But the phone buzzed once in his hand, and without thinking, Nate glanced at the screen. A single text message was visible on the lock screen, and it said, "He knows." Nate put the phone in a drawer under the counter and told himself that he had seen nothing, that the message meant nothing, that the best thing to do was to wait for the owner to return. The owner did not return that night, and when Nate locked the doors at 6 in the morning, the phone was still in the drawer. He did not take it home, he did not tell anyone, and he tried to forget the whole event by the time he fell asleep in his small apartment as the sun rose. But forgetfulness did not come easily, and when he returned to work the following night, the black sedan was already parked at pump 4 waiting for him. The same man stepped out of the car, the same heavy coat, the same rehearsed movements, but this time he did not go to the pump first. He walked directly to the glass door and entered without buying anything. Nate stood behind the counter with his hands flat on the surface, and he did not move. The man approached slowly, placed both hands on the counter, and stared at Nate with empty eyes. He did not speak a single word. Instead, he pointed one finger at the drawer under the counter where Nate had hidden the phone. Nate understood immediately, opened the drawer, and placed the black cell phone on the counter. The man picked it up, nodded once, and then wrote something on a small piece of paper, which he slid toward Nate. The paper said, "Did you see anything last night?" Nate looked at the words, then at the man, then back at the words. He shook his head slowly, a single motion that meant no. "I saw nothing, I know nothing, please leave." The man stared for 10 seconds, then 20 seconds, then half a minute, and then he smiled without warmth, turned around, and walked out of the store. He did not fuel his car, he simply got back into the sedan and drove away, disappearing into the same darkness he had come from. Nate stood frozen behind the counter for a full minute after the taillights vanished, and then he did something he had never done before. He walked to the window and looked at the spot where the car had been parked. On the pavement, where the passenger door would have opened, there was a single drop of something dark, something that could have been oil or coffee or something else entirely. Nate did not investigate further. He returned to his post and waited for the rest of his shift to end in silence. But the silence felt different now, heavier, as if the night itself was watching him more closely than before. He finished his shift, locked the doors, and went home without speaking to anyone. The next night, he found an envelope under the floor mat of his own car parked in the employee lot behind the station. The envelope contained a large sum of cash, more than he made in 3 months, and a handwritten address. The address led to a warehouse on the outskirts of town, a building that had been abandoned for years according to the neighbors. Nate did not go to the warehouse. He burned the address in his sink and spent the cash on nothing, hiding it under his mattress like a shameful secret. 2 nights later, a second envelope appeared, this time taped to the inside of his front door at home. More cash, a different address, and a single word written in red ink: "Wait." Nate realized then that he was no longer just a witness, he had become a participant whether he wanted to be or not. He tried to call the police from a payphone, but the line was dead before anyone answered. He tried to quit his job, but the contract he had signed with Mr. Cade contained a clause he had never noticed before, a clause that said leaving without notice would result in forfeiture of everything, though it did not specify what everything meant. Nate was trapped, and the only person he could ask for help was a man he had never seen, a man named Mr. Cade, whose notes kept appearing in the lockbox behind the counter. One note, fresh and crisp, said, "The boy in the back seat is named Kyle. He has been missing for 6 weeks. You will not speak of him, you will not look for him, you will continue your shift as if nothing has changed." Nate read the note 3 times, folded it carefully, and placed it in his pocket. He did not cry, he did not pray, and he did not run. Instead, he went back to the counter, waited for the next customer, and began to watch more carefully than ever before. 3 weeks passed, and the pattern became undeniable. Every Tuesday and Thursday night, the black sedan appeared at Pump 4 between 11:30 and midnight. The man, whose name Nate had never learned, would exit the car, fuel it slowly, and enter the store to buy something small, a bottle of water or a pack of gum. He never looked at the passenger seat himself, but Nate had started looking, just for a second, just a glance, every single time. On the first Tuesday, he saw a shape under a blanket, a shape that moved slightly as if breathing. On the second Thursday, he saw a hand, pale and small, pressed against the window glass. On the third Tuesday, he saw a face, young and terrified, with eyes that locked on Nate's for a single heartbeat before the car drove away. That face belonged to Kyle, the boy from Mr. Cade's note, and Nate could not unsee the fear in those eyes. He also could not ignore the envelopes that kept appearing, each one containing cash and instructions, each one pushing him further into a web he did not understand. The instructions were simple: do not speak, do not record, do not remember. But Nate did remember, and he started keeping a small notebook hidden inside the hollow leg of the counter, a notebook where he wrote down every license plate, every timestamp, and every detail he could observe without breaking the rule entirely. He wrote down that the man always wore the same coat, always paid with exact change, and always left the gas station heading east toward the abandoned warehouses and the frozen river. Nate also wrote down that the passenger window was never rolled down, not once, not even on the warmest night. After 6 weeks of this silent observation, Nate made a decision that changed everything. He decided to break his rule completely, not by looking, but by acting. On a Thursday night in January, when the black sedan pulled up to Pump 4 at 11:20, Nate did not wait behind the counter. He walked outside, approached the driver's side window, and knocked twice. The window rolled down slowly, and the man's face appeared, calm and expectant. Nate did not speak, but he held up the small notebook open to a page filled with dates and times and license plates. The man looked at the notebook, looked at Nate, and then did something unexpected. He smiled, reached into his coat, and pulled out a key. He placed the key on Nate's palm, pointed toward the passenger door, and nodded once. Nate understood. He walked around the car, unlocked the passenger door, and opened it slowly. Inside, wrapped in a thin blanket, sat a young man named Kyle, his wrists bound with cloth, his mouth free but silent. Kyle looked at Nate with exhausted eyes and did not say a word. Nate reached out his hand, and Kyle took it, climbing out of the car on unsteady legs. The driver did not react. He simply waited as Nate led Kyle toward the gas station's back office, a small room with a lock on the door and a phone that had not worked in years. Nate locked the door behind them, sat Kyle in a chair, and handed him a bottle of water. Then he went back outside, but the black sedan was gone, vanished without a sound, leaving only tire tracks in the thin layer of snow. Nate did not call the police because the phone was dead. He did not drive Kyle anywhere because his own car had 2 flat tires, slashed cleanly through the sidewalls. They were trapped together in that small gas station with no way out until morning, and Nate spent the remaining hours of his shift learning things he wished he had never known. Kyle wrote down his story on pieces of receipt paper because he could not speak without crying. He wrote that he had been taken 6 weeks ago, that the driver never hurt him but never let him go, that there were others before him, others who had disappeared into the same black sedan and never been seen again. Kyle also wrote that the driver worked for someone else, someone called Mr. Cade, the same name on Nate's contract, the same name on the lockbox, the same name that had been watching Nate for 14 years without ever showing a face. Nate asked no questions. He simply read each piece of paper as Kyle pushed it across the floor, and he felt something he had not felt in years, anger, not at the driver, but at himself for having followed the rules for so long without ever asking why. He thought about all the nights he had looked away, all the passengers he had refused to see, all the envelopes he had accepted without resistance. He thought about the yellowed note on the wall that said "Respect the night and the night will respect you," and he realized now that the night had never respected anyone, it had only used them. Kyle finished writing, folded his hands in his lap, and waited. Nate looked at the young man, at the bruises on his wrists, at the hollow look in his eyes, and he made a second decision. Kyle would not go back into that car, not ever again. But Nate also knew that the driver would return, that Mr. Cade would not simply let Kyle disappear, and that the gas station was not a safe place for either of them. The only way out was to wait for sunrise and then run, but run where, and to whom, and with what protection? Nate had no answers, only the growing certainty that his 14 years of silence had made him complicit in something terrible. He sat on the floor across from Kyle, and they waited together in the dark, listening to the wind outside and the occasional sound of a distant truck on the highway. No one came for them that night, no black sedan, no envelopes, no notes in the lockbox. When the first light of dawn appeared through the small window of the back office, Nate stood up, helped Kyle to his feet, and opened the door. The gas station was empty, the pumps were silent, and the road stretched east toward the nearest town. Nate pointed, and Kyle nodded, then Kyle ran, without looking back, without saying goodbye, without any promise that they would ever see each other again. Nate watched until Kyle became a small dot on the horizon, and then he turned around, walked back inside, and began his morning routine as if nothing had happened. He cleaned the counter, emptied the trash, and checked the lockbox behind the register. Inside was a new envelope, still warm, as if it had been placed there only moments ago. Nate opened it with trembling hands and found a single sheet of paper with 3 words, "Thank you, Nate." Below that, a new contract, extending his shift indefinitely, with a raise that would make any other man rich. Nate read the contract twice, then 3 times, and he understood. Mr. Cade knew everything. Mr. Cade had always known everything. And Mr. Cade was not angry, he was pleased. Nate signed the contract without reading the fine print, because he understood now that there was no escape, only different kinds of cages. He went home, slept until sunset, and returned to work at 10 in the evening. The black sedan never came back, but the rule remained. Nate Porter continued his night shift as if nothing had changed, but everything had changed. He no longer looked away when a car pulled up after midnight, he looked directly at the passenger seat every single time, but he never saw anything unusual again. No bound wrists, no terrified faces, no blankets hiding breathing shapes. The customers who came after midnight were ordinary people, tired drivers, truckers drinking coffee, young couples arguing in low voices. Nate found himself almost disappointed by the normalcy, and that disappointment frightened him more than the black sedan ever had. He had become someone who expected to see suffering, someone who looked for it, someone who felt empty when it was not there. He tried to remember the young man named Kyle, but the face had already begun to fade from his memory, replaced by the faces of 100 other customers who meant nothing. He still had the notebook hidden in the hollow leg of the counter, but he had stopped writing in it weeks ago. There was nothing to write, no patterns, no mysteries, no envelopes taped to his front door. The cash under his mattress remained untouched, and the address he had burned in his sink was nothing but ash. Nate told himself that he was free, that Mr. Cade had lost interest, that the whole episode had been a strange dream from which he had finally woken. But deep down, he knew the truth, Mr. Cade had not lost interest, Mr. Cade was simply waiting. The notes in the lockbox continued to arrive every Monday morning, but they were ordinary notes now, instructions about inventory, reminders to clean the filters on pump 4, schedules for the part-time worker who came on weekends. Nate followed every instruction without question, not because he was afraid, but because he had forgotten how to do anything else. 14 years of silence had shaped him into the perfect employee, the kind who never asked why, who never looked too closely, who never remembered what he saw. He was exactly what Mr. Cade had wanted all along, and that realization was the heaviest burden he carried. One night in March, 6 weeks after Kyle had run down the highway toward the nearest town, a young woman pulled up to pump 2 at exactly 1 in the morning. She was alone in the car, or so Nate thought, until she opened the driver's door and reached into the back seat to wake a sleeping child. The child was small, maybe 4 years old, wrapped in a blanket that looked exactly like the one Kyle had been wrapped in. Nate froze behind the counter, his heart pounding, his hands gripping the edge of the register. The woman entered the store, bought a carton of milk and a bag of chips, and paid with a smile. She asked Nate if he worked alone every night, and Nate nodded without speaking. She said that must be lonely, and Nate shrugged. She left, and Nate watched her car disappear east, toward the abandoned warehouses and the frozen river. He told himself that it was a coincidence, that thousands of people owned blankets like that there was no connection between a young woman with a sleeping child and a black sedan driven by a man in a heavy coat. But the coincidence did not feel like a coincidence, it felt like a message, a reminder that Mr. Cade was still there, still watching, still weaving threads that Nate could not see. He checked the lockbox the next morning, and there was no envelope, no note, no contract. Nothing. The absence of anything was somehow worse than the presence of something, because it meant that Nate had imagined the whole thing, or worse, that Mr. Cade had decided Nate was no longer worth contacting. Nate spent the next month in a state of quiet paranoia, checking the lockbox every hour, examining every customer's face, looking for the man in the heavy coat who never appeared. He lost weight, stopped sleeping during the day, and developed a twitch in his left eye that would not go away. His co-workers noticed but said nothing. They had learned long ago that Nate did not welcome questions. The part-time worker, a young man named something Nate could not remember, once asked Nate why he always looked at the passenger seats of cars that stopped after midnight. Nate did not answer. He simply walked to the back office and locked the door until the young man left. That was the last time anyone asked Nate a personal question. The weeks turned into months, and the months turned into a year. Spring became summer, summer became autumn, and autumn became winter again. On the first Tuesday of November, exactly 1 year after the black sedan had first appeared, Nate arrived at work at 10 in the evening and found a single envelope on the counter, placed exactly in the center, with no return address and no name. He opened it with shaking hands, and inside was a photograph. The photograph showed a young man standing in front of a small house, smiling, holding a child in his arms. The young man was Kyle, older now, healthier, with color in his cheeks and light in his eyes. On the back of the photograph, someone had written 2 words in red ink: "He is safe." Nate stared at the photograph for a long time, and then he did something he had not done in 15 years. He cried. He cried not because he was sad, but because he was relieved, and because he finally understood what Mr. Cade had been doing all along. The envelopes, the cash, the instructions, the black sedan, the driver, Kyle, the blanket, the key, the contract, the silence, it was all a test, a long and cruel test to see what kind of man Nate Porter really was. And Nate had passed, not by following the rules, but by breaking the most important one at the exact right moment. He had looked at the passenger seat, and he had acted. That was why Mr. Cade had thanked him. That was why the contract had been extended. That was why the photograph had arrived 1 year later, to show Nate that his choice had saved a life. Nate put the photograph in his pocket, wiped his face with the back of his hand, and went back to work. The black sedan never returned, and the rule about not looking at the passenger seat was eventually forgotten by everyone except Nate. He kept the rule for himself, not because he was afraid, but because he had learned that some rules are meant to be broken, and some are meant to be kept, and the only way to know the difference is to look. Nate Porter worked the night shift for 5 more years, and then he retired without fanfare, moved to a small town near the ocean, and never spoke of the gas station again. He kept the photograph on his nightstand until the day he died, and when they cleaned out his apartment, they found a small notebook hidden in a hollow leg of an old chair, filled with dates and times and license plates that no one could explain. The notebook ended with a single sentence, written in red ink: "I looked, and I am glad I did." The gas station still stands at the edge of the small town, and if you drive past after midnight, you might see a new face behind the counter, a young man who does not know the old rules, who looks at every passenger seat without fear. He does not know about Mr. Cade, or the black sedan, or the boy named Kyle. He does not know that silence can be a cage, and that looking can be an act of courage. But the night knows, and the night remembers. And somewhere, in a place that cannot be found on any map, Mr. Cade is still watching, still waiting, still sending envelopes to people who do not yet understand the role they are meant to play. The story of Nate Porter is over, but the story of the gas station has no end. Drive past if you want, but do not stop. Do not ask questions. And if you see a black sedan at pump 4, keep your eyes on the road and your hands on the wheel. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved, some rules are not meant to be broken, and some nights are better spent looking away. Nate learned that lesson the hard way, and he carried it with him for the rest of his life. You do not have to make the same choice, but you should know that the choice exists, and that every night, somewhere in the world, someone is standing behind a counter, watching the road, and deciding whether to look or to look away. The answer is never simple, and the consequences are never small. That is the truth that Nate Porter discovered, and that is the truth that he took to his grave.